The prisoners and deserters, with faces marked by a mixture of fear, relief and defiance, were housed in the cellars of Khatkovo. They were for the most part from Kyrgyzstan and other regions to the south of the Ural Mountains, and in their confined conditions stank most frightfully. While they were largely older men and young boys, there was the occasional man among them who stood out as a soldier in the mould of the Tsar's army, one of whom, when asked what his father did, answered he had been the Pope. A pope is best described as a local priest. Our interpreter was Leopold, a young Volga German and a teacher who had been taken prisoner in the Vitebsk region. Now dressed in a German uniform, he marched east with us in the quiet belief that one day he would find his way back to his home village. Many of the Russian prisoners, wearing rags or tattered uniforms, carried a cooking pot on their back or a tiny sack of potatoes under one arm. The closer we came to Moscow, many of the more recent prisoners possessed, to our amazement, fire-red beards and bright blue eyes. The Soviets, in retreat, had press-ganged thousands to work on defence construction, and these were now flowing west in a desperate attempt to return to their homes, now lying to the west, far behind our lines. Refugees with their pathetically overladen horse and carts had by now all but disappeared, for the advancing winter made any open road venture a serious hazard. During those first few days, the convoys of motorised vehicles never let up day or night, and on that dusty Russian road there was only one law, and that was to keep moving. Our small group of the Officer Reserve Battalion pushed on through the old front line and the battle zone of early August with its flattened villages, trampled crops and shredded woods, and up onto the Shidki Heights. It had been there where the Russians had broken up to 80 or 100 metres into our front line, and we surveyed the well-constructed defences so desperately fought over. What struck us was how the many enemy dead had been systematically stripped of their boots. We approached across a field littered with destroyed Russian armoured vehicles, each in rust-brown colour with hatches open and gun barrels pointed skyward. In this way, we neared the edge of a vast moorland lying immediately in front of the sector facing the 6th Division. The Russians had retreated over the swamp on 2 log roads which our engineers had been speedily repaired and were now our main supply routes. Next, we passed the enemy's reserve positions with their heavy gun emplacements and covered tank shelters, all of which had been prepared in depth and skillfully camouflaged, proving that the Russians were still masters at making the best military use of the terrain. Our objective for the day was the extended village of Baturino, which had apparently been the command post of an enemy rifle division, only now the place was virtually empty. Taking over a local clubhouse, we piped in water, had the stove lit, and by importing a few bits of furniture were soon comfortably ensconced. Despite the rain and low clouds, the trusty Junker 52 transport planes continued to pass overhead in groups of 2 or 3 while on the ground. We followed a newly constructed road along the Kokosh Valley, before arriving late in the afternoon at the village of Petrova. The Russians must have abandoned the place in a hurry, because pigs, sheep and cattle were still running around freely, and we gladly accepted repeated invitations from our field kitchen staff, who served up fresh potatoes, warm milk, gherkins that reminded me very much of home, and unrefined but tasty bread. Back on the main route of advance, we merged with the traffic, but found our progress greatly hampered, for by 1 p.m. we had advanced no more than 2 kilometres, with all motor traffic frequently grinding to a virtual standstill. Not since the Polish campaign had I experienced this kind of congestion. In the end, thanks to our horse-drawn transport, we succeeded in turning off the main route of advance and reaching a small village where we bivouacked for the night. There, in one of the huts, we stumbled upon one of the worst exemples of dirt and misery we had encountered thus far. 6 half-naked children sleeping in a stinking, tangled heap on a mud floor, and lice-infested men and women, clad in evil-smelling rags and worn-out straw sandals, living in conditions so squalid and filthy that one could barely see out of the windows for flies and fly drop. Pings. Between 7 and 8 kilometres to the north of town, our reserve battalion found accommodation in the village of Borodina, in the very same house where our divisional commander had been quartered, and for the first time in many months our own Captain Baumann was able to sleep in a proper bed. Between the window panes we found cotton wool and strips of coloured paper designed to create a friendly atmosphere, while at the same time shutting out the cold and the inevitable barnyard smells. The house was situated in a pleasant village south of Substo, and boasted solidly crafted furniture perhaps inherited from an older generation. There was none of that cheap Soviet factory mass-produced stuff. The old farmer had apparently died following the Soviet expropriation of his land, and his son, a teacher, had been killed early in the war. His wife, the mother of a 2-year-old boy, dressed in black with crude felt boots on her feet, was now the head of the household. She too had been a teacher, and her refined manners suggested a family background far removed from subsistence farming. She also spoke a little German, and among the many books in the house I found a Russian-German dictionary, a collection of coloured prints and drawings depicting the Russian Revolution, and a number of photographs taken as early as 1914. Until we reached Subzau, our advance was generally in a northeasterly direction, but afterwards we turned due east along a Soviet-built road and bivouacked in a village alongside the Moscow rail line. Here we encountered a peasant who spoke broken German, and it turned out he had been a POW in Silesia during the Great War. We were back on the road on October 22nd, and due to the heavy rains all traces of snow had vanished, leaving individual vehicles and entire convoys to struggle through a bottomless morass. The villages we passed through were often filled with our vehicles that had either broken down or had run out of fuel. Our supply convoys were starting to break down, and the men up front were having to live off the land. The lack of fuel was so great that anti-tank companies attached to the infantry and the signals units were compelled to remove their guns and equipment from their motorized transport and carry them forward on carts and horse-drawn vehicles. It quickly became clear that our division was hugely stretched. While the commander and staff were some 10 kilometers northeast of Staritsa, the regiments were still some distance away and in the progress of crossing the Volga. In doing so, all available units were needed to fight off determined enemy attacks and to keep the road to Kalinin open. At the end of 2 miserably wet days, the sky suddenly cleared, and a powerful wind out of the west quickly dried the land and stripped the last leaves from the many bleach-white birch trees. In the clear, cold air and over freshly seeded fields, grey stubble and swaying birchwoods we could see towards an almost endless horizon. To the east that night, we were treated to a lively but silent fireworks display which we guessed was the defence of Moscow in action. A Russian nearby remarked cheerfully, "Stalin kaput," forgetting that only a few years earlier he had likely stood by equally happy while the village manor house was burned to the ground and the landowner driven into exile. On the 29th of October, our little reserve circus was on the move once again. Instead of continuing north towards Staritsa, we now headed east, leaving the town off to our left. We were to cross the Kalinin road and then make our way over the Volga. 20 kilometers to the north of us, the division was heavily engaged combating strong Russian resistance and frequent counterattacks, one of which coincided with our arrival. The Russians advanced in to our rear via an open flank and were soon at our river crossing point at Utilino. One of my infantry school classmates, a Captain von der Kammer and commander of the 14th Company, while on his way to the divisional command post, drove into a village that had just been retaken by the enemy. There, his men and vehicles were badly shot up. Hit in the arm, von der Kammer was thrown to the ground, losing both his artificial legs. Feigning death while the Russians tore the vehicles apart, he was rescued several hours later. Von der Kammer had lost both lower legs when he stepped on a mine in 1939, but once fitted with 2 prosthetic limbs insisted on being able to serve. This is an excellent example not often described in contemporary accounts of the kind of resilience and devotion to duty found among the men and officers of the German armed forces at the time. The terrible tragedy is that the bravery and courage of these men, of whom Wilhelm was one, was so cynically betrayed by Hitler and his Nazi gangsters. Even if the intervention of 110, 161 and 162 divisions made life easier for most of the forward units, the last few days of October and early November saw much bitter fighting and heavy losses. While the enemy made liberal use of his plentiful ammunition, we were obliged day after day to limit our ammunition expenditure to less than a normal day's usage, and our artillery was often required to hold back even when presented with a worthy target. More losses were incurred through the Russian tactic of spearheading their attacks with tanks. On one occasion, they succeeded in flattening one of our new 5 centimeters anti-tank guns before it could be brought into action. Luckily for us, these armoured forays were seldom accompanied by supporting infantry. On the 5th of November, our division had worked its way up to the Chema River, where it went over to the defensive, and about this time the regiment's adjutant informed us that Captain Witter had been recommended for the Knight's Cross and was to be sent back to Germany as an instructor at the War Academy. In the centre of the twin villages of Jurjevskoye, Gorky, surrounded by a stone wall, stood one of the largest churches we had seen thus far. Its interior had been badly damaged during the fighting, exposing once again many brilliantly coloured wall paintings. Next to the church stood a sad-looking house which was home to the priest and his family, and on that same sunny afternoon I noticed an old woman in her orchard leaning on a stick. What was so remarkable was that instead of the usual tattered rags, straw shoes or felt boots, she was wearing leather shoes, stockings and a well-cut dress. So accustomed had I become to the sight of poorly clad country folk that even this small observation remained indelibly imprinted on my mind. On the 6th of November, I was given orders to attend a winter survival course in Gashatsk, to which I was joined by a lieutenant and a staff paymaster by the name of Paul, both from the Officer Reserve Battalion. We thumbed a lift into Staritsa, a hair-raising journey, for while the road was no longer a bottomless morass, the frost had turned the mud into deep frozen gullies and jagged mounds, reducing our progress to a walking pace, and even then the truck creaked and groaned most horribly. At sundown we finally reached the first shabby huts of Staritsa and a church around which there had clearly been fierce fighting. The road dropped off down to the banks of the Volga, where, on the river's edge, surrounded by a partially demolished wall and watchtower, stood an 11th century abbey, in which men were knee-deep in books and papers, including a copy of Napoleon's memoirs and volumes written in both German and Latin. Now we stood in the valley of the mighty Volga, watching drifting ice floes thundering and breaking up against our pontoon bridge. When faced with the prospect of reaching the steep Lime River embankment on the far shore, we knew this shaky bridge was our only means. That evening and the next day, we made use of a house which had belonged to a former Russian landowner, which, despite having been used as a Soviet kindergarten, had retained its old character. We made ourselves comfortable and took full advantage of the last remaining cutlery, dishes and furnishing. On the morning of November 7th, in the midst of a snowstorm, a heavy-tracked vehicle of the 26th Division arrived to carry us to our course. There were 5 participants from the 5th, 6th and 26th Division who, aside from me, Paymaster Paul and a doctor, were all lieutenants. The armoured car proved to be a ship in the desert, for when the road became clogged it took to the fields, and in that manner we made reasonably good progress. The roads were filled with horse-drawn supply columns, motorised transport moving in both directions and road construction crews, more than half of whom were huddled around a huge fire. Near Rushu, we overtook a long column of Russian prisoners shuffling along wrapped in whatever they could find. Here and there a body lay in the ditch, someone who could go no further or had been given a coup de grace. Since far and wide all water sources were frozen solid, the wretched prisoners were compelled to eat snow to quench their thirst. By midday we had covered 50 kilometres before stopping for a break in Oshu, a town that had been completely destroyed. There we thawed ourselves out in the offices of a field hospital. After that, and without further delay, it was on to Supzau, along familiar roads via Shizuka to the 9th Army Command Post, which we finally reached after dark. To our dismay, no one was expecting us, and having received word that the course had been pushed back by 8 days, we settled into a room at Army headquarters. During that waiting period, I took up learning Russian again, read books from the small army library, and visited a cinema set up in an abandoned church. Another church nearby had been used as a shop, but now stood empty, and I was reminded of the biblical expulsion of the moneylenders from the temple. A third church had been converted by the Soviets into a corn silo, which, luckily for us, they had failed to burn down. Here behind the lines, in contrast to the opposing armies at the front, we came upon many astonishing contradictions. An example was when each morning a German cart bearing the bodies of those Russian soldiers who had died overnight in the nearby POW camp would routinely drive along the riverbank, passing by groups of Russian boys who, untroubled by the ghoulish sight, continued to gleefully skate on the river's frozen surface. Another example was an imposing wooden building on the riverbank which housed a Russian army hospital. From our quarters, we could see into the rear courtyard where medics and doctors moved about in their blood-stained aprons and surgical gowns, throwing refuse and rubbish out the door, while at the same time flirting with the female soldiers. What the interior of the building must have looked like one could hardly imagine. On the pavement in front of the hospital, a number of girls from nearby villages had gathered to cheerfully exchange gossip, all the while remaining blissfully unaware of the misery behind the walls under which they were joking and laughing. Over at the railway station, where the rail lines were filled with goods wagons and a busy little locomotive was shunting back and forth, elements of the Luftwaffe Flight Corps were having trouble loading a battered truck. For them, it was back to Germany, to the vicinity of Vienna. On neighbouring tracks, hundreds of fuel barrels were being unloaded, while yet another supply train stood patiently waiting to be unloaded. On the pavement beside the rails lay a number of dead Russian soldiers, some wearing only a shirt. It was here where hundreds or perhaps even thousands of POWs had been loaded onto trains, and it appeared that neither hunger nor cold had made them all bend to the will of the guards. Astonishingly, mere meters from that scene, young children were gleefully tobogganing down a small slope, and it was heartwarming to hear their laughter. One could see among the population a growing degree of resolve and renewed enterprise, especially in the vicinity of the corn distribution centres, or at the offices of the city commander. Faces brightened when the subject of future plans and goals in their small lives came up. It also seemed to me that from some mysterious corner better quality clothes, fur hats, overcoats and shoes had been recovered, and were once again being worn with pride. There was even a fine example of female elegance. A young woman sitting in a cafe in a dark overcoat, white knee-high felt boots with finger gloves and a cap matching her coat. She could easily have been a teacher in a local middle school. On the 16th of November, our journey finally resumed, as the course was now scheduled to begin on the 18th. After a 7-hour wait at the station, our train to Vyazma was ready to depart. Nearly a third of the rattling, unheated wagons were filled with wounded, and another third with about 2,000 POWs. By 10 that night we reached Vyazma, during which time, however, about 50 prisoners had died of cold and hunger. We watched the long, dark, sad human column march off into town, guarded by an NCO and 6 men, and next morning on our way to the South Railway Station, we came upon a number of corpses lying at the edge of the road, POWs who had died of hunger and exhaustion. The ugly truth was that the city population, and indeed some of the country folk, were going to stare death squarely in face during the coming winter months. We drew upon the experience of the Russo, Finnish War, and yet, despite some excellent suggestions, our conclusions proved far too optimistic, a fact that was sadly confirmed as soon as I returned to the division. With companies in rifle strength of no more than 20 or 30 men, the establishment of new ski companies was no longer possible, and the notion of setting up special commando units completely out of the question. As for equipping troops with skis, that, in the end, was also shelved for the time being. At division, I was for the most part accommodated in a Russian forest encampment with barrack buildings constructed half below ground. During a tour of our kilometre-wide position, I noted happily how we had inherited kitchens, saunas, bakeries, machine and woodworking shops, demonstrating once again the Russians' skill in erecting functional earth and log installations. At the easternmost edge of the camp stood the so-called Timoshenko House. This was an elegant 2-story log house, and was believed for a time to have been Timoshenko's headquarters. It was in that house where I first came across a central heating system in the Soviet Union. Field Marshal Timoshenko was one of Stalin's generals tasked with halting the German advance in 1941. When he failed to push the enemy back, Stalin replaced him and sent him to the Stalingrad district. He survived the Stalin purges and lived on until 1970. Our course accommodation came complete with radio, nightly cinema presentations and cosy evenings around an electric light. However, on Sunday the 30th of November, it was time to return to our respective units. 2 omnibuses first brought us along the highway to Vyazma, where we bunked down in the dark of a freight car of a train bound for Rshiw. The 8 p.m. promised departure was delayed, and it wasn't until 4:30 a.m. before, shivering with cold, we finally set off for Rshiw, where the 9th Army Course participants went their own way. After staying the night, Paymaster Paul and I hitched a ride on one of our divisional trucks, and in no time were through Staritsa, and once again at Jurjevskoye, the former location of the reserve battalion. Road conditions had greatly improved with snow and ice having smoothed out most surfaces. The division was still in its former position, but the reserve battalion had been reduced to an assembly spot for POWs, some 20 kilometers north of the Volga. My attempt to cross the frozen surface of the river with horse and sled failed, because no one was able to point out the crossing points in the dark. Due to uncertain ice conditions, I decided to cross over the pontoon bridge at Ulitino, where Captain Ferber of the 6th Sapper Company gave me a lift, and at midday on the 3rd of December, I was once again in the presence of Captain Baumann. My nearly 4-week absence from the division proved to have been an eye-opener. Not only was I able to study life behind our front line, but also learn from a cross-equal sign section of about 150 fellow officers of Army Group Centre, from which I concluded that even if the composition of the officer corps was no longer as uniformly created as it had been at the beginning of the war, or even as far back as 1933, most were still first-class individuals and excellent examples to their men. Among the 150 officers were 2 from the SS who greeted each other with a schoolboyish hooray. Observing those 2, it occurred to me that once the war was won, the marked differences between the Army and the SS were likely to result in unpleasant confrontations, proving just how fatuous, arrogant, and immature we Germans are as a people. Another unhappy subject raised on the course was the basic needs of an army in winter, such as skis and proper clothing, and comparing those with the harsh reality of our pathetically clad and ill-equipped frontline troops. During my first few days back, I organised a ski course, but instead of 1,000 pairs of German skis, we were handed 100 individual Russian boards, each with a simple leather strap for a binding. In the end, we were able to match up 40 pairs with reasonably functioning bindings. Using the excellent pair of Munich skis given to me on the course, I often covered up to 20 kilometers either under a full moon or through thick fog, and in doing so, quickly became familiar with the surrounding countryside. Both landscape and weather were routinely described in letters and the frontline newspaper as utterly bleak, but I never felt that way. The onset of winter marked the end of the miserable wet, cold autumn weather, and the fresh snow covered all dirt and misery, and gave the fields, forests, and huddled villages an almost festive air. Our divisional sector lay between the Volga and the Ima rivers, an area that boasted a certain level of prosperity and cleanliness. The winter quarters had been prepared with considerable care and thoroughness, rendering the interior of many houses likely unrecognizable to their former occupants. Birchwood furniture, pictures, and painted stoves gave many a room the feel of a Bavarian farmhouse. We had first-class stables and a well-signed posted road network at our back. This quietly organised existence of some 20,000 men was defended by 6 shrunken battalions and a handful of artillery units amounting to between 1,500 to 2,000 Rifles. Paymaster Paul and I occupied a low, snow-covered house set in the shadow of a single fir tree, and off to one side, barely visible in the snow, stood 10 birch crosses marking graves of the dead of 58th Regiment, for during the last days of October, this area had been heavily fought over. In this location, I conducted ski instruction until one day I was ordered to quickly bring the course to an end. That evening, huge flames were seen rising up from the west. We had then no way of knowing that our troops had evacuated the town of Kalinin. The regiment advised me they had no further need of ski training, whereupon I happily made my way back to Captain Baumann and the peaceful life in reserve with its regular mail, electric lighting, radio, and the study of Russian grammar. Not long after, I heard a rumour that our division was planning a strategic withdrawal to a more favourable line of defence, a notion that was soon confirmed by orders issued on the 17th. I was assigned to accompany Lieutenant Colonel S. and drove with him to examine the territory and to establish contact with reconnaissance units of our neighbouring divisions to the north and south. On the 19th, a row of villages to our rear went up in flames, and on the 20th, the night sky was brightly lit by a chain of burning villages starting in the north and reaching over the Volga to the south, and despite the distance of 12 or 20 kilometres, the white of the snow was turned bright red. Rendered speechless, the pathetic villagers stood on the street corners and stared towards the blood-red horizon. Next came the order to evacuate all able-bodied men to the rear, leaving women and children to the advancing Russians. On the following day, it was the turn of our village to undertake the separation of men, women, and children, all of whom accepted their lot with quiet resignation. While a few set off for Staritsa, the women, sometimes with a cow, a goat, or a sheep in tow, bundled up their children and vanished into the driving snow. Many of these poor folk would die of cold and hunger, or suffer being shot by one side or the other. We helped our host family with horse and sled and added a sack or two of potatoes and baked goods before depositing the daughter and her 2 children on top. They too were then gone, but had left the old grandfather behind to meet an uncertain fate. He and his daughter had looked after us by touchingly carrying water, lighting fires, and even assisting in pushing our truck out of the deep snow. It was during those days of retreat that war's ugliest face became truly visible. All former care and attention given to the villages, to their stocks and animals, was abandoned in the most reckless fashion, and eyewitnesses from the front reported that the Russians were driving back those civilians coming towards them, so that in the end the women simply threw themselves down in the snow and let happen what may. Hardly had the withdrawal begun than it was rumoured that the army's commander-in-chief had resigned, something which was confirmed a few days later by the announced resignations of von Bock and von Rundstedt. Now we had lost 2 of the best brains in the German officer corps, just as the Russians had lost Timoshenko and Budeny. Unhappily, the shameful manner in which these men were forced out is comparable with the equally humiliating dismissal of Stalin's generals. I thought back to Dunkirk and reflected how encouraging it must have been for all of Britain to know that the generals responsible for the catastrophic flight from the continent had been publicly decorated for their leadership. I therefore asked myself, why could we not have smoothed out the exit of our leaders by rewarding them for their distinguished service in Poland, Norway, Denmark, the West, and in the Balkans? We could have later, if necessary, announced their retirement on health grounds, and in doing so preserved their dignity and reputation. Instead, our setback was blown up into an all-out crisis of leadership, which, together with Hesse's flight to England, served only to create another seed of doubt in my mind. Before the invasion of Russia in June of 1941, Hitler's deputy, Rudolf Hess, flew to England in a misguided attempt to secure a peace treaty with England, rather than Germany face war on 2 fronts. He was arrested, put on trial at Nuremberg, and spent the rest of his life behind bars in Berlin's Spandau prison. Hitler denied authorizing the flight, but it was suspected that the idea had come from the very top. Also, if indeed the British generals were decorated after Dunkirk, then it would have been for their successful evacuation of the army rather than see some 300,000 men become prisoners of war. The unexpected shuffle at the top of the Army General Staff in the middle of a crisis was a stunning blow to US officers and an immense propaganda coup for the enemy. Now they could really ask who is in charge. Following victories in the West, the glory was all Hitler's, but when the army was faced with misadventure in the East, then the generals were to blame. No sooner had we left behind our well-prepared positions to the west of Kalinin than the demands made on artillery and infantry began to border on the superhuman. Day and night, our greatly outnumbered infantry fought off the enemy with equipment not yet adapted to winter, and with each Russian penetration, our numbers became desperately low, and in places we were forced to blow up our guns and even abandon our wounded to the enemy. On the morning of the 23rd, we found ourselves in a fierce snowstorm, which only added to our misery by bringing nearly all motorized traffic to a halt, and it was only with aid of horses that we were able to cover the distance to Ryszu. That day, and in the days ahead, we were given renewed proof of how irreplaceable our horses were, especially when faced with fuel shortages and abysmal road conditions. Our principal form of transport was now either a horse-drawn sled or a high-axle horse-drawn army wagon with which we were able to get about, and what was particularly astonishing to me was how well our horses had adapted to the bitter cold and the biting winds. On the afternoon of the 24th, the sky cleared and the sun made a brief appearance before disappearing again behind a thick fog over the town of Staritsa. A Soviet bomber made an appearance at a height of about 1,500 meters, and instinctively I sought the protection of a nearby house wall, just as a stick of whistling bombs began to fall. The last one struck the stables, where a heavy artillery piece was being limbered up. 2 men were killed, 3 wounded, and 10 of our heavy draft horses either killed or so severely injured they had to be put down. To better defend Ryszu, we had to familiarize ourselves with the Königsberg defense line and determine where added reinforcements were required. However, our initial contact with the Labour Battalion proved unsatisfactory. Although construction crews were fully manned and had been notified of our arrival well in advance, those in charge had failed to build anything more than the most primitive of defence systems. The Labour battalions had been shifted here and there to repair roads instead of concentrating on what would later become the main front line. Added to that, they lacked sufficient dynamite with which to penetrate the frozen ground, and it was only when the division was forced to deviate from the carefully planned withdrawal and abandon Starisa in disarray did enough explosive suddenly materialize. That was a mere 10 hours before the enemy launched his next attack. It was also unclear where our divisional sector lay, and even up until the 1st of January, our front-line troops complained of there not having been any prepared line of defence. It was all very depressing. While we defended the villages, the Russians, untroubled by the thick snow, occupied the open spaces and the forests all around, and were able to filter into our rear. Defence of the so-called Starisa line saw costly fighting both day and night, leading to the loss of many of our best officers, an irreplaceable number of NCOs and other ranks, all of whom were either killed, wounded, frozen to death, or taken prisoner. Combined with that was the particularly heavy loss of equipment and vehicles. To the south of Starisa, a Russian cavalry detachment had lain in ambush along our main supply route, and no sooner had the enemy been repelled than we were presented with an indescribable scene on the road. Those who occupied the Königsberg defence line were the scattered remnants of many units. Half of the division's artillery was lost, and the size of Regiment 58 was reduced to 250 officers and men. 3 battalions had been reduced to 1, with similar conditions prevailing in most infantry regiments and other service groups. By comparison, a peacetime regiment has a complement of usually 3 battalions, each with about 1,000 men, roughly 3,000 officers and men. The battle raged without let-up, with more and more losses, leading me to the belief that the 6th Army Corps had been mortally wounded and was in the process of bleeding to death. What was most difficult to bear was the feeling that the German soldier had for the first time lost his sense of invincibility. Whereas before, orders to seize a distant objective would have been received by our soldiers in the belief they had the means, the strength, and the support to achieve their target, the advance had now turned to retreat, and the men could see for the first time that behind the few remaining worn-out regiments there was nothing except the agony of a Russian winter. To me it was incredible how once punctilious and reliable army commanders had allowed themselves to become gamblers, because by now it was painfully clear that our advance into Russia was nothing more than a mighty bluff. Admittedly, our political leaders had in the past succeeded in gaining much through the use of bluff and bluster, but now the army was paying for this reckless gamble with frightful, irreplaceable losses. On the 3rd of January 1942, following depressing days with the reconnaissance staff with whom the sheer scale of the disaster was constantly before my eyes, and where the question most asked was, can we hold the Russia defence position, or will it come to another ignominious retreat? I received orders to report to the regiment. At the same time, I learned that the divisional order that day began as follows: every step back will only lead to disaster. This was a statement that closely matched my own view, yet as I was driving east along the Starisa road towards Russia and my regiment, I was confronted by a small flood of horse-drawn carts, motorized vehicles of all description, heading the other way in chaotic disorder. Perched on vehicle hoods and fenders, lying on sleds and carts, were exhausted and wounded soldiers of all services, while others hobbled wearily along in rags and worn-out footwear. One man had removed a boot and had wrapped his frost-bitten foot in rags, while others with arm, neck and head wounds struggled along wrapped up to the eyes in blankets, as feeble protection against the biting wind that scythed across the flat, unbroken steppe. Upon reporting to the regiment, the commander at first wanted to dismiss me again, but in the end ordered me to stay, and thus I found myself once again in the usual cramped front-line living quarters. On the morning of the 5th, the enemy suddenly attacked out of the woods to within 300 metres of our position, and we lost contact with our sister battalion 3 kilometres away. At the east entrance to the village of Malachowo, one of our mortar batteries had come under heavy machine gun and sniper fire. The crew sheltering behind their weapon were as helpless as a bunch of kids. That was the situation I faced when arriving at the firing line to help organize the defense. Following several very uncomfortable minutes, an artillery observer emerged from the village, followed by a platoon from the Signals Detachment 46, and finally in the evening a whole company of recently arrived parachutists. After careful artillery preparation, I gave the order for this motley group to advance both sides of the road towards Ranitsa. In the face of this determined assault, the Russians fled, leaving many dead and wounded behind their hastily thrown-up banks of snow. Just as the light was fading, I reached the far side of the wood, about 1 kilometre this side of Ranitsa, together with a group of parachutists. Although others behind us were still exchanging gunfire with Russians in the wood, we had ventured quite far forward. In the half-light, about 50 metres away, under tall pine trees, stood a number of Russians in white snowsuits, waving and calling out to us. I had hoped to take them prisoner without a fight, so in turn waved them to come over to us. Who started the shooting, I could not say, but luckily we had taken cover behind a snowbank just as the Russians opened fire with all they had. Reaching for my submachine gun, I discovered, to my dismay, that in the excitement I had left it at my last battle station. At that moment, about 20 paces away, a young parachutist who had been calmly firing on one knee was hit and killed, so I moved another of his mates over to the spot and took his weapon while at the same time ordering an end to the indiscriminate firing in order to conserve ammunition. The young airborne soldiers gradually calmed down and only fired when a clear target presented itself. Observers were posted to our left and right to report any attempt by the enemy to hit us in the flank or from the rear. Happily, the enemy at that moment appeared to have no further appetite for battle, and any movement on their part brought about a veritable hail of bullets from our automatic weapons, which threw up a cloud of snow, and here and there stripped the bushes of their branches. In due course the enemy became less active, and just as they appeared to be leaving the area, a reconnaissance squad belonging to the Lost Battalion made its way towards us, and after that the coast was clear. Much relieved, we stood up and took stock. Sadly, 3 young parachutists lay dead, each shot through the head. This small action reaffirmed in my mind that whereas our men are first-class infantrymen and technically excellent when handling their automatic weapons, most had, however, lost touch with nature. Unless they were hunters or woodsmen, city dwellers no longer possessed the eye, the ear and instinct that allowed them to take advantage of weather and interpret the sounds of the forest. In this respect, the Russian soldier was far better equipped, and as a consequence was able to inflict heavy casualties on us. It was my view that following war's end, a soldier's training should take place both day and night out in the country far from the comforts of city life. I spent the 5th of January at the regimental command post in Malachowo. The front line had held, but at what cost? Now we were going to have to pay in blood for the failure of the Labour battalions to construct the Rocheux defence line, which could have easily been completed with only a little planning and foresight. In my own Stariza defence line, there was not a single prepared position, and the enemy moved his artillery and anti-tank guns, almost at will, into the nearby woods before beginning to shoot up one house after the other, while at the same time attacking in battalion strength, sometimes as many as 4 or 5 times a day. On one particular day, our battalion losses from killed, wounded and frostbite reached 70, and with an overall rifle strength of no more than 220 a breakthrough seemed inevitable. My old 7th Company had by this time been reduced to 10 or 12 men, and my former batman, Vihi, who had served me so well between June 1940 to June 1941, was killed by a direct hit. Within only a matter of a few days, 4 officers in the battalion had also become casualties. By fighting desperately, we were finally successful in bringing the Russian assault to a halt, although to the west of Rocheux, the enemy had made a break through the consequences of which we were only to discover during the following weeks. We had heard there had been fierce fighting around Sidchevka, during the course of which our only rail connection, Rocheux-Vyazma, had been blown up. In the meantime, Soviet attempt to encircle us had been thwarted, and those enemy units that had broken through, including, we were told, an entire army headquarters, were themselves now trapped. This piece of information came to us from a Führer broadcast, and was our first bit of good news since the middle of December. On the 17th, I received orders to put together a unit of drivers, signallers, cooks, clerks, and members of divisional staff along with a flak company, and assemble in a village called Sinkino, immediately behind the main battle line. We had the use of light machine guns, however there were few who knew how to use them, so that the value of this ad hoc formation was doubtful. After 4 days of training and making preparations, during which luckily we had not been engaged by the enemy, I was summoned on the 21st of January to assume command of one of the regimental battalions. Much relieved, I made my way over to Ranitsa to take over from Captain Wickett, who had come down with a case of diphtheria. My new command was unfortunately short-lived, because Captain Marcus, having recovered from his wounds, was on his way back. Nonetheless, the sheer sense of fulfillment in carrying out my work overshadowed the insane shuffling around of commanders. I had developed a curious ambivalence to whatever task I was assigned to, and had by then cast aside any long-term military ambition. Whether employed to lead a stopgap crew of cooks and drivers in a last desperate counterattack, or to be battalion commander of a handful of survivors mattered not one bit to me, because by now, as never before, survival depended on one's own decisions and actions. Ranitsa, until 3 weeks before, had been a village full of people, animals and barns filled with harvested crops, complete with columns of white smoke rising up peacefully from its many chimneys. The ensuing death and destruction could not have been more terrible. Those left behind following the evacuation included women, children, and a few old people who, along with horses, cows, and small animals, now lay dead in and around their barns and little houses. Countless distorted shapes now lay under a blanket of snow locked in death's hold, not to be released from winter's frozen grasp until the arrival of spring. On the 27th of January, a Russian shell landed squarely on a stack of landmines piled up a mere 10 metres from my command post, causing a huge explosion. When the dust and smoke had settled, and we saw our post was still intact, my Batman Wallraff and I attempted to climb out, only to discover that the barn above us had collapsed and a tangle of beams blocked our exit. When we finally emerged, what we saw was astonishing. Next to my command post there was a 4-metre deep and 7-metre wide crater with large lumps of frozen earth along its rim. Powdered slime, dust, and the remains of 2 barns had turned the white of the snow into a dirty black smudge. During the day, it was only our men who were seen moving about in this scene of destruction, but at nightfall, horses and sleighs belonging to supply units arrived and departed, although, understandably, their drivers refused to linger. A few of their number, having been caught earlier by a Russian 12 centimetres cannon, now lay as dark mounds in the snow. They had been killed while crossing a small bridge in the centre of the village, which had been skillfully identified by the enemy as a target of opportunity for random artillery fire. All that remained of a nearby apartment building were its walls and shattered roof. Its 19 occupants had fled down the village road, and when I climbed over the rubble and came upon a free-standing stove, there sat a brown cat calmly followed my progress. This creature was, I guessed, the last remaining sign of village life in Ranitsa, although when compared to the heavy fighting that had taken place before my arrival, everything seemed to be almost at peace. I spent many an hour in the woods south of the village overseeing improvements to our defence positions. During the Kshatsk winter training course, this area had been described as one always exposed to high winds, and indeed there were days when it blew both warm and cold, creating in the process huge snowdrifts. Much to my pleasant surprise, however, those blustery days were by no means typical. In contrast, we often stood beneath deep blue skies under a low winter sun in a silent forest, which seemed to be patiently listening to the world all around. February brought fresh snow, which, when added to the renewed brightness of the sun, converted the forest into a sparkling fairy-tale wonderland. Each time we crawled out of our dugouts into daylight, we were often so blinded by our 6-foot-high wall of snow, which reflected the sun, that it took us many minutes to adjust our eyes to the crooked walls and gaping roofs of the village. For me, the winter climate was invigorating, and at times I sensed I could live to be 100. He did live to be 100. Some 300 metres to the south of Ranitsa, between a neighbouring village and situated on a flat open field, stood a small stand of fir trees, creating a corridor directly to enemy-occupied forest. At this very spot, where walls of snow separating the two sides were a mere 200 meters apart. There had been fierce fighting during the first part of January, and each morning when inspecting the line, I felt my eyes settle on the dirt-black shell holes and the many splintered trees, and my thoughts went back to baby-faced Captain Graminsky, who had been killed in one of these craters by friendly fire. During the night, while preparing his battalion for an attack, he and his men had come under the fire of our own artillery, which was intended for the Russians dug in some 200 meters away. I had met him when he too was assigned to the reserve battalion, and I quickly detected how much the inactivity and being sidelined had eaten at him. He had been a regimental adjutant and saw himself well suited for a general staff job. Between Christmas and the New Year, we had worked together on the reconnaissance staff, and through his contacts with Fleurop, I was able to send floral greetings to Patricia. I remember at the time thinking that by the time the floral greetings from Central Russia arrive in Pomerania, I might be dead, although now I know fate had other ideas for me. Aside from random explosions of incoming enemy artillery and the sharp sound of individual sniper fire, all was relatively peaceful in Ranitsa, or village Gutenka, as we now called the place. Let me explain. I first laid eyes on Gutenka at Regimental HQ in the hot summer days of 1940 France. He had been regimental point man, and never before had I come across a face of flesh and blood so filled with energy, hard self-discipline and forthright decency. Of course, behind this soldierly demeanour there was much more, but he was in all senses a complete warrior. I first met him while in the company of Captain Baumann, the former WW1 officer, and at the time he had been a lieutenant and commander of the 5th Company which he had accompanied to the Russian front. He was a former Reichswehr sergeant major, although he never spoke of those days, and despite some unfriendly gossip in the regiment, was always direct, to the point, and a good friend. Gutenka was quickly recognized as an expert in infantry tactics, and was the best instructor in the regiment. His performance in carrying out any task assigned to him, be it from battalion or regiment, was closely followed by all eyes in the division, even by the commanding general himself. Gutenka had a face marked by a wide, firm jaw and a dominant, slightly upturned nose, a feature often found among highly energetic people. Most noticeable were his mouth, which was no more than a thin line, and his thick bull-like neck. Gutenka died while leading his men in an unsuccessful counterattack carried out through knee-deep snow. The failed attack must have occurred east of Staritsa, on the banks of the Volga, from where he and his dead and wounded could no longer be recovered. Word of his death spread swiftly throughout, and all those who knew him felt that the regiment had lost an irreplaceable pillar of strength. During the defence of 2 hilltop villages, each with a large white church staring out over the Volga, the 2nd Battalion was virtually cut off and pressed in on all sides by an overwhelming number of the enemy. Only a narrow 2-kilometre-long gap of deep snow was still open, although it too was covered on all sides by Russian machine gun fire. Over on our right, the 11th Company was encircled, and the remains of the 3rd Battalion could only watch as its company commander, Lieutenant Lang, and the remnants of his unit were forced to emerge with raised hands and surrender. I wonder today what the village of Staritsa looks like after its many buildings and towers had been set on fire. Up until 1914, the community with its comfortable city dwellings, cottages and estates must have been a scene of thriving Russian life, and indeed reminded me of tales told by my parents. The present, however, was more brutal. No more was it a war, as 25 years ago, against a nation who understood the laws of civilization and the Geneva Convention, and although some of the Russian POWs, especially the medics, attempted to treat their wounded with care and dignity, we knew both sides were in a merciless battle for survival. Whoever fell into the enemy's hands was usually beaten to death, and time and again the wounded who could not be rescued preferred to take their own lives. All too often, a Russian officer or commissar would rather put a bullet in his head than be taken prisoner. Hitler had ordered that commissars and commando-type troops were not to be taken prisoner. Whereas in the West this order was largely ignored, it was rigidly applied on the Eastern Front, where prisoners from both sides were routinely executed. In the immediate vicinity of the town of Sobakino lay the parachute battalion Schmidt, which within a matter of days had been sharply reduced in number, a situation that allowed us to obtain some much-needed clothing and equipment which was so much more superior in quality to that of the regular army. Abundant equipment and supplies lay all around, so our people were able to take possession of new clothes, solid boots, warm overcoats, and plentiful ammunition. It appeared that for this unit no expense was too great, and although the Paras fought with great bravery, they lacked vital Russian front experience. Whereas we had built up large defensive snow walls in front of our position, no such work had been done in their front line. Similarly, when the Russians spotted movement and fired a few shots, the parachutists usually replied with a barrage of bullets without achieving much other than guaranteeing that their sector was likely to remain a hot spot both day and night. On the 21st of February, the enemy attacked the left flank of our regiment in a roughly 300-man strength and came up against Battle Group Bush, which had curiously retained my name. Because our people routinely listened in on enemy signals traffic, the attack came as no big surprise, yet the Russians succeeded in overrunning one of our strong points and taking 3 prisoners. The following morning, however, the enemy was evicted, losing in the process over 100 dead and 150 prisoners. February 23rd was the day of the Red Army, so, in expectation of an enemy attack with tanks to mark the occasion, all units were placed on high alert. However, happily that beautiful sunny day was to remain relatively uneventful. At the beginning of March, Colonel von Tresco appeared before our small group of battalion officers to bid us farewell. He was being assigned to the 4th Army in the Central Front sector for special duties. His successor was the diminutive but eager Lieutenant Colonel Hirsch, who had previously been commander of the division's reconnaissance unit. This change in command was felt immediately, especially when it came to the treatment of his people. Over a period of several weeks, a rear area defence line had been prepared at the edge of the forest. The planning and execution had been exclusively the work of the lieutenant colonel, who in later battles would wade through waist-deep snow to outline with his cane where additional defences were to be built. He made a habit of involving himself in every last detail, even deciding how dugouts were to be protected and where stoves were to be placed. Under this unusual attention to detail, his poor adjutant, whose job it was to know of all regimental activities, was frequently kept in the dark. At this point, I was assigned the job, with the help of a Labour battalion, of preparing the defence positions of 2 companies. This was something I thoroughly enjoyed and spent many hours in the woods to the west of the village finishing the work begun by others and assisting the 2 company commanders in their respective sectors. There was much to be done, and the days flew by until one day the snow started to become wet and sticky, turning the ground in our dugout to mud. Not only did we now suffer from wet feet, but the frost and cold still returned accompanied by high winds and vicious storms. Snowbanks grew to the size of houses, and the manpower needed to cut wooden beams had to be redirected to keeping the roads clear. Throughout this period I kept asking myself how on earth we were likely to achieve success and force a positive outcome in the east. At best, I surmised, we might make the river Volga or the Ural Mountains into a military border against an exhausted but restless enemy. But were our manpower resources sufficient to achieve such an end? Another quite different question was whether there were enough good people to administer the economies of not only the recovered territories of East Prussia, Posen and the Wartheland, but also Upper Silesia, as well as defend the added eastern territories. Finally, just how strong was the commitment of the German people to support our continued drive to the east? For example, barely a single officer, NCO or soldier, declared himself willing to remain there. We had, after all, chosen to invade this land, and were now compelled, whether we like it or not, to remain if for no other reason than to survive. Already, by this time as early as the winter of 41-42, most soldiers were having serious doubts about the outcome of the war, and not being exposed to the propaganda of the home front, were beginning to ask many questions. There was perhaps, however, a continued conviction that they were saving Europe's from the scourge of communism. To the size of houses and the manpower needed to cut wooden beams had to be redirected to keeping the roads clear. Throughout this period, I kept asking myself how on earth we were likely to achieve success and force a positive outcome in the east. At best, I surmised, we might make the river Volga or the Ural Mountains into a military border against an exhausted but restless enemy, but were our manpower resources sufficient to achieve such an end? Another quite different question was whether there were enough good people to administer the economies of not only the recovered territories of East Prussia, Posen and the Wartheland, but also Upper Silesia, as well as defend the added eastern territories. Finally, just how strong was the commitment of the German people to support our continued drive to the east? For example, barely a single officer, NCO or soldier declared himself willing to remain there. We had, after all, chosen to invade this land and were now compelled, whether we like it or not, to remain if for no other reason than to survive. Already by this time, as early as the winter of 41-42, most soldiers were having serious doubts about the outcome of the war and, not being exposed to the propaganda of the home front, were beginning to ask many questions. There was perhaps, however, a continued conviction that they were saving Europe from the scourge of communism. The newspaper announcement of George's death. One day, I found a letter from Patricia lying on my work desk in which she informed me of the death of my brother George. He and his battalion had been engaged in the assault on Sebastopol. On the evening of the 16th of December 1941, he wrote a letter home announcing that he was participating in the forthcoming assault, which he declared was bound to succeed, given the huge and thorough preparation. He was killed on the morning of the 17th at a time when the town had still not fallen. No sooner had I received word of George's death than a letter from my parents arrived, announced my 18-year-old brother's induction into a tank unit in northwest Berlin. Once again there were two of us in the army. Along with the news of my brother's death, I got some idea of the fighting in the south. Bit by bit, principally through reports from the head of the 9th Army, General Model, a picture emerged of the full extent of the bitter fighting, and it soon became clear to all just how our fate on the Eastern Front hung by a slender thread. It was also amazing to me how we succeeded in supplying our sector through the long narrow corridor with only a single frequently threatened rail line.